So here we go. My name is Michael Rosenberg, and I am the author of The Story of Bendelot. That was my first book. There is a second book called The Story of Bendelot Part 2, a third book called The Little Lost Tune, and now shortly a fourth book which will be called Chili, the Lost Polar Bear. I'm going to read you some extracts from my first book just to give you a taste. It starts like this. One day, many years ago, there was a village high in the mountains of Eastern Europe, so high that no one outside knew it existed, and the people who lived there had no idea that there were other towns, villages, and cities outside their own little world. Some rather suspected that they could not be alone in the world, but for as long as anyone could remember, they'd been happy and content in their own place. They lived off the land and were used to hot summers full of flowers and amazing scents from the many varieties of plants and trees. And although they did eat meat, they only did so on special occasions, since they really loved their animals. I haven't stopped, I'm just continuing. They tended to live to quite old ages, and indeed the oldest villager had just celebrated his 125th birthday by singing and dancing in the square to everyone else. Families were at peace with each other, and everyone helped in the community using such skills as each possessed to make sure that no one wanted for anything. Of course, there was no television or computers and no phones, so entertainment was made by those who could sing or dance or tell stories. They had many talents who could build sturdy houses which were cool in summer and warm and cosy in winter. In the village lived a family called Rosenberg. The father was known as Stefan and the mother was Amelia. They had 2 children, a boy called Handy and a girl called Sandy, who were twins. Now, what I have not explained is that there was something a bit strange about the people of Bendelot. They were all slightly bent over, a bit like little old men. But they also had a curious ability, which was sometimes a help and often a problem. Everything that was made of metal would bend if they touched it. Over the years, they had developed a skill in making certain types of metal that could withstand this bending. From time to time, it could be useful. But in general, it was a bit of a nuisance. However, as long as anyone could remember, this had been how they lived. So it was not really thought as anything very odd. Indeed, most of their furniture was made of wood, so this made life a lot easier. One day, Handy and Sandy were in one of their favourite places by a mountain stream, collecting flowers and herbs and watching all their favourite animals chasing around the woods. I'm going to show you a picture of them. Here we are. Hope you can see it. Well, suddenly they heard the sound of someone approaching through the woods. It was not a happy sound, but the person seemed to be crying, and no one cried in Bendelot unless someone had died, and even then only for a short while, since they all knew that after death there was an even happier existence in the next world. The sound grew louder until through the bushes strode a small boy about the same age as Handy. Only to Handy it was a tremendous shock to see this boy, for he was standing straight rather than bent, and was wearing strange clothes. But what was even stranger was that around his waist he had a belt, and hanging from the belt was a shiny metal object, which to them seemed to be an oversized knife. He didn't see the children at first. His eyes were full of tears, and he was covered in scratches from top to toe, which must have come from the branches in the wood, and his clothes were torn, and he was dripping wet. Here he is. Look at him. Look at him. As he entered the small clearing where they sat, he looked up and let out a gasp of astonishment, which was matched by the gasp of Handy and Sandy. Immediately he took the big metal object from his belt and waved it at them. Then he proceeded to shout in a language they didn't understand and ran around the clearing with his metal thing racing round the air and crying at the same time. While he was doing this, he tripped and fell over a root, and the metal thing went flying through the air towards the children. They rushed forward and Handy grabbed it, whereupon of course it immediately bent in two. At that the other boy let out a wail and covered his head with his hands in total fear and collapsed on the ground in a faint. He was shaking so much his clothes started to fall off him. Well, the children were equally frightened, but they were also concerned about this new friend. So they approached the boy and tried to comfort him with soothing words. Sandy went to the stream and filled a cup with fresh, cool water, which he offered the boy. Then they gathered some leaves and used these to bathe his scratches. All the time he was babbling in this strange language, but bit by bit he calmed down and they tried to communicate with signs and mimes. Gradually they found a way to understand a bit and found out that his name was Brumflaw, and he came from a place called Stettelburn, many miles across the mountains. And what had happened was really odd. One day there was a huge storm, and then in the distance, racing towards them, was what appeared to be a tornado. A tornado is an enormous wind that whirls around faster and faster and sucks into the air anything in its path. Brumflaw had been in the field with his family, but the tornado came so quickly that before he could run, he was swept up into the sky and carried swirling and dancing in the air until he lost consciousness. Next thing he knew, he'd been dropped into a mountain river, which took him racing across many miles till he came into the stream near Bendelot. Fortunately, he had the metal sword which helped him cut his way through the thick oak undergrowth. Now he was lost and terrified, for he had no idea that another village existed, just like the people of Bendelot. And of course he couldn't understand how they could bend things as they had with his sword. Well, that's just a little taster of the story. And you'll see there's lots of interesting pictures here of strange animals that they find, all kind of weird and wonderful creatures that they find in the forest. And later on, they find a big, friendly giant. Look at the giant. Wow, look at him. So it's full of lots of stories. So I guess if you like what you've heard, just tell your mummies and daddies, or if you're a mummy and daddy, just go out and buy my book, Part 1, Part 2, and the third one, The Little Lost Tune. You can get them online in Amazon. Enjoy.